Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Acterra's Spring 2020 lecture series, Eating Our Way Out of the Climate Crisis, Turning Bad Emissions into Good Soil Carbon. This is the third and final lecture for our Spring 2020 series, which is focused on our interlinked agriculture and soil systems and its role in promoting climate solutions and ecosystem health. My name is Robbie Brown and I'm the Community Engagement Associate for Acterra. If you are not familiar with Acterra, we are a San Francisco Bay Area nonprofit based in Palo Alto. And we largely focus on bringing people together to create local solutions for a healthy planet. Our lecture series fall under our educational programming, where we have a key goal of compelling the wider public to recognize the urgency of our current climate crisis, as well as to inspire them to take appropriate actions needed. In education, we have three core areas. So we have climate resilient communities, where we focus on empowering and alleviation of climate impacts for under-resourced neighborhoods. We have Youth Be the Change, which is a leadership and educational program based around the topic of climate. And then we have the public lecture series like this one, where we invite leading voices from academia, businesses, and policy to discuss global climate change issues. Acterra does not endorse or support the expressed opinions of any of our speakers. Our aim is just merely to present a diverse range of views to help advance these conversations and to allow deeper reflections on challenging issues. Next, we wouldn't be able to continue our we wouldn't be able to continue to host our lecture series without our amazing underwriters and sponsor support. I would like to thank Marion Clinton Gilliland and Armand and Elaine Nukermans, as well as our sponsors, the Bay Area Quality Management District, and the Foster, which is located in Palo Alto. We have two upcoming events I would like to mention. The next one is tomorrow, which is our Young Professionals Virtual Happy Hour. If you are a young professional interested in networking, environmental trivia, and learning from other young professionals in the area about sustainability, please feel free to join us tomorrow night. It is free. You can find the link on acterra.org/events. Then July 29th, we have our third, or perhaps it is our fourth morning coffee hour with Lauren. This gives you a great opportunity to meet with her, discuss about Acterra's programs and our future direction. Today's speaker is Anthony Myint. He is a chef and food activist who co-founded Mission Chinese Food and is mobilizing the restaurant industry toward climate solutions through his nonprofit Zero Foodprint. Anthony was recently awarded the Basque Culinary World Prize for his work beyond the kitchen. And Zero Foodprint is collaborating with the California Department of Food and Agriculture, California Air Resources Board, Cal EPA, and California Resource Conservation Districts on a new program called Restore California. Restore California applies the model of community choice aggregation to the food system by directing a few cents per meal to provide grants to help farmers implement more renewable practices, such as compost application and planting cover crops. Great, now I'm gonna hand it off to Anthony. Are you ready?
Sure. Thank you so much to Acterra for inviting me to be part of this event. It's really encouraging to me and exciting the amount of interest in regenerative agriculture and carbon farming. So I should also begin by saying that, so as Robbie mentioned, I'm a chef and activist, and I guess when I started cooking, I probably did so to avoid talking to people. And so it's like a little bit ironic that, you know, this is my lot in life. I'm almost like a traveling salesman for agricultural climate solutions. So I'll give you a little bit of quick background and then kind of how I ended up in this place, kind of working on soil carbon and global climate solutions. And then get into some of the specifics about our work at the moment and how there might be opportunities to collaborate with some of you or your companies. So we started doing pop-ups in 2008, and this was before the term pop-up even existed, as far as I know. And we were operating in first a Guatemalan snack cart, which moved into kind of a hole-in-the-wall Chinese restaurant. And we started inviting guest chefs to come and do half the menu, and I did the other half of the menu, and we had a different theme each night. And we did that for about 140 weeks or 140 events, sometimes 2 a week. My wife joked at the time that it was like planning a wedding twice a week. And so it was very improbable to me that I even ended up kind of as a chef, because at the time I was a line cook and almost sort of like ended up running a restaurant by accident. And we always had a charitable agenda at Mission Street Food, and we were benefiting local hunger-related efforts. And eventually that transitioned into a permanent pop-up called Mission Chinese Food, which some of you may know, and which I'm still involved in. My chef friend, business partner at Mission Chinese Food, Danny Bowen, who was like the chef and creative genius behind that concept, moved to New York and opened a Mission Chinese Food there in basically a shitty Thai takeout window in the Lower East Side. And miraculously, that restaurant was named New York Times Restaurant of the Year in 2012. And so he and I kind of found ourselves in this celebrity chef world with, you know, drinking a beer in the backyard of the #1 chef in the world, or kicking a soccer ball around with, you know, the #2 chef in the world or something. And it's definitely not something that we expected or, you know, had the intent of doing, but I guess that's sort of just speaks towards like the improbability and the potential in the industry to kind of connect with different people. And so about 8 years ago, my wife and I had a daughter, and we started thinking more about climate change and the future and the food system, and realizing that, you know, we should do something. Like I think at that time, you could say 0 chefs were working on climate change. But the restaurant industry is really big. It's like in the US, it's an $800 billion industry pre-coronavirus. And so we started working on it in 2 main directions. One is a nonprofit called Zero Foodprint that I'll get into more in a minute. And the other is a restaurant called The Perennial, which is where we first learned about regenerative agriculture. We were really trying to explore a lot of different climate solutions. So at first we were thinking along the lines of conservation and food waste, you know, plant forward and some of the usual ways that people think about food and climate. But pretty quickly we found kind of this idea that soil can hold carbon. And I mean, in a way, it's kind of like high school biology. I think a lot of us know this to a certain extent. We understand that, you know, cutting down trees is bad for the environment. But whereas you can see when you cut down a tree, the absence of, you know, this big chunk of biomass, or you can see that when you plant a tree, you know, 30 years later, there's a big tree trunk, and that's a living thing, and that's carbon. I think what we don't really see is the carbon in the soil. That if you're plowing every year and spraying chemicals, that you're gradually and systematically killing the organic matter, the biomass in the soil. And conversely, that you can farm in a way that is building that biomass. And, you know, there's this term in circulation, regenerative agriculture. And that's kind of referring to that phenomenon of like, you know, increasing soil health, increasing the carbon in the soil. But in a way, it's also just good farming. Like a lot of the practices of regenerative agriculture are not something new or based on technology. It's compost application, it's planting cover crops, it's reducing or minimizing tillage, it's planting trees on rangeland, or managing the way cattle graze. And so as we started to learn this story, I mean, to me, it was very optimistic and kind of like a real shift from, you know, the only solutions being like not eating the things you like or eating bugs or trash or whatever stuff. You know, that's a pretty challenging future to embrace, whereas a future of healthy soil, delicious and nutritious food, you know, really any food can be produced regeneratively. And so this idea of kind of like a climate beneficial and positive future and an optimistic and plausible one, I think is what really has inspired our ongoing work in this area. And I hope all of you guys as well in some shape or form down the line. That said, it starts to become clear that in order to really make a difference in terms of climate, we need to change a lot of acres of land. And so globally, there's something like 8 billion acres of cultivated land. And the vast majority of that is grassland, which I think it's worth noting has, two fundamental characteristics, or maybe they're not necessarily characteristics of all grassland, but a lot of it is in an arid environment and not necessarily suitable for growing crops. And a lot of it benefits from, or potentially even needs to have ruminants on the land. And so pretty quickly, as we've been learning the story, it starts to become clear that there's a lot more to farming than the average person knows. Like, I think if you kind of talk to the average chef or the average diner or consumer and kind of ask them like, hey, please define healthy soil. If you asked me that 5 years ago, it would have been really hard for me to answer that question. You might think like it's organic certified, or something. But fundamentally, I think I can say with confidence now that healthy soil has a lot of living things in it. And so living things are made of carbon. The organic matter in soil is 50 to 58% carbon. And so when you start to imagine like, the top 6 inches of 1 acre of soil, weighs millions of pounds, like 2 million pounds or something. And it starts to become like very plausible that there's billions of acres, all of which can increase the amount of organic matter by 1%, 2%, 5%. And in fact, that would actually just be restoring the carbon that the soil has lost over the years. It starts to become optimistic and positive that we can actually solve this and put a lot of the carbon back into the soil if we can figure out the systems to make that change. And so at this restaurant, we were running the perennial. We were sourcing beef from a carbon ranch in Marin, or in Petaluma, this pilot of the Marin Carbon Project. We were, baking artisanal tartine-style sourdough bread from a perennial grain called kernza, which is being developed by a nonprofit in the Midwest called the Land Institute. And so in many ways, these kinds of ingredients are sort of like the Tesla of food. I mean, that was what we were hoping to do, is like get people really excited, create a premium, people paying an extra $1 for these things. But how it turned out, unfortunately, is that people would get excited and ask like, oh cool, where can I buy this? And it, we almost had to say like, oh, there's very little supply. And after 40 years of organic agriculture, organic represents only 2% of global farmland and 2% of farmland in the US. I think in California, maybe it's like 3% or something. And so it started to become clear to us that in order to make change on acres, like to really make the kind of systematic change that would represent a real climate solution, we needed a different approach than just trying to buy good ingredients, than trying to just make good choices and kind of hope that the system changed. We needed a way to actually make direct change. And so I'll jump into a quick slideshow here that gets into some of these mechanics. And so part of how we arrived here is through a collaboration with the state of California, as Robbie mentioned, and it's the Department of Food and Agriculture, the Air Resources Board, Cal EPA, and a consortium called the California Resource Conservation Districts, which oversees like 95 offices around the state that are helping farmers implement regenerative practices, conservation practices. And the program that we've arrived at is called Restore. And so you can almost think of Zero Food Print as like the lead certification that's going around and working with restaurants as members of an organization. And the main way that restaurants are members is by investing in carbon farming and other climate solutions. And Restore California is kind of like the recipient of these funds, and it's a program that is distributing the funds to farmers optimally and equitably. And so I'll get into some of those mechanics, but fundamentally the way it works is that zero food print restaurants are adding a 1% charge, and any customer can opt out of that charge. And we are directing that money to carbon farming projects across California. Farmers and ranchers are applying in collaboration with the resource conservation districts. And let me just move on here. So these are some of the chefs and restaurants that are participating. And this is a very new movement. So we started Zero Food Print years ago, and our primary way of engaging restaurants throughout the years was getting restaurants to go carbon neutral. And so some of you may know about that term and like run businesses that are carbon neutral. You know, basically it was getting restaurants to complete a life cycle assessment and offset their scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are like energy and waste hauling with offsets, and then to starting in January, contribute to carbon farming projects. And that's when we also kind of introduced this 1% version, in part because over the years, pretty much every single restaurant that was carbon neutral, you know, in order to participate, it took less than 1% of their total sales. And so it started to feel like, rather than hinge everything on assessments and a slightly complicated process, you know, that we should allow restaurants to participate both by addressing their environmental footprint by being carbon neutral, or by addressing their economic footprint. And so that redirection towards agricultural climate solutions through the 1% is what is like brand new and just started in January. And in March, we were fortunate enough and honored to be named the James Beard Humanitarian of the Year. I think the announcement came out on March 10th. And then the whole restaurant industry shut down and is now on life support. So we're looking forward to seeing where this goes in the long run. And so I wanted to give some big picture context about regenerative agriculture. These numbers are from Drawdown. Drawdown is an amazing, you know, kind of meta-analysis that shows a bunch of different climate solutions. And I focused here on 4 primary solutions for regenerative agriculture, 2 with crops and 2 with livestock. And so I kind of alluded to this before, but one characteristic of grassland is that it benefits from, or potentially even needs, ruminants to graze, you know, nibble on the grass, promote growth, get rid of, you know, last year's old dead grass, and to, you know, poop and pee and stomp that all in and provide nutrients. And so there's a little bit of a false binary with beef that sort of looks at the current industrial farming and meat production system as one system, when in fact I would argue that it's 2 completely different and separate systems. One is animals on grassland for a year or so before they go into a feedlot, and then 2, a feedlot where the animals are crowded. Maybe there's a lot of like manure lagoons and antibiotics and things that we don't like. That first part is a really big system. In the US, there's 760 million acres of grassland and pasture with cattle on it. You know, the vast majority of that goes into a feedlot, but there's no reason that we couldn't work with that grassland ecosystem and those farmers and ranchers to improve their practices and take carbon out of the atmosphere on those 760 million acres. And so in a way, our theory of change is sort of like, instead of, you know, trying to get people to pay $15 for a grass-fed burger and then hoping that somehow that rancher who sells into a feedlot notices that and, you know, borrow $500,000 from a bank or something and make a change on their land, instead of that sort of like system with a lot of disconnect, perhaps there's a different system that's more like a renewable food economy, where, you know, if you're buying a fast food burger, maybe 1% of the charge, or 5 cents per burger, could just go back to that rancher to help make that change on those, you know, incredibly vast landscapes. Sorry, so I'll get into that in a minute. But basically here on this slide, we see that regenerative agriculture and carbon farming can remove quite a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. 103 gigatons, and that it not only represents an operational savings to society and the operators, but also a benefit for the farmers and ranchers. And so it's really like one of the rare solutions that's like, you know, just a win-win-win with no regrets. And the only challenge is sort of like breaking from business as usual to create a new normal. And so Robbie mentioned that we're inspired by a lot of the progress that's being made in the renewable energy field through a paradigm called collective economic action. Through a paradigm called community choice aggregation. And that's basically just collective economic action. You know this in different counties and cities as a program where the utilities company might be charging you like $5 more per month, and anybody can opt out. It's kind of not a big deal. 5 or 10 years later, a whole city or county has renewable energy. And so our hope, and I think in many ways what our collaboration with the state of California is around, is trying to create and normalize this paradigm in food, that a few cents per meal from restaurants could go towards direct investments in renewable energy, or I'm sorry, regenerative agriculture on farmland across the state, and that it wouldn't all depend on kind of like a few people paying a lot more for a good and then hoping that over time it changes and production changes, and instead just directly changing the practice. And so we kicked off in January through a collaboration with San Francisco Restaurant Week, and a bunch of our participating restaurants shifting towards these agricultural climate solutions. So these were some of the first projects that we funded, and you can find more information about this at our website, zerofoodprint.org. There's a little link for carbon farms. Part of the development that has been going on like around the world on soil carbon and regenerative ag is that there is now the ability to estimate how much carbon a given practice is taking out of the atmosphere. So there's something called the Comet farm tool and the Comet planner, and Comet is just a kind of wonky acronym that stands for CO2 measurement tool. But so the Comet tool was developed by Colorado State University in collaboration with the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service. And it's using, you know, really robust soil database data from the USDA, as well as farm census data. And, you know, you can basically like take a given county, let's say in California, like Marin County, and you can put in an example project. You know, a dairy wants to apply compost on 20 acres. And you plug in this information, and then it can basically tell you, you know, according to the best science available, this practice should take 80 tons of carbon out of the atmosphere each year on the 20 acres, you know, and this should keep going for like 5 years, 10 years, etc. And so, you know, making another analogy to kind of environmental work, you know, if you imagine like planting trees, there's not like a researcher out there necessarily like putting a tape measure around every single tree. There's just kind of a understanding of how much carbon that takes out of the atmosphere. And so regenerative agriculture is starting to, you know, be in a similar place where we can model the benefits. And so this tool was developed in 2017, and it's constantly being refined. And I think the hope is that in time, the confidence intervals will be tighter and tighter, you know, especially as more data keeps coming in, and that we'll be able to just all get going on changing farmland or changing farming practices. And so the way Restore California works is we basically invite a farmer to name their price for a project or a practice. And so someone might say, you know, apply for a grant with a request for $10,000 to apply compost on 20 acres. And so we can basically use the tool in conjunction with resource conservation districts and other technical experts and kind of derive a climate return on investment. And so that's kind of what this column is. And then we're basically sorting by that column and then funding the best projects. And this is now a little bit in the weeds, but I'm going to just proceed for a second just to float the examples in case they're of interest. So we have this collaboration with the state of California, and it's it's essentially like casting a very wide net and asking chefs and restaurants and businesses to opt in. And what we're finding is that there's a really compelling opportunity at smaller governmental levels, like at a city level or county level, to make a really big difference. And so just using an example, in Northern California, there's a county that we're in discussion with that, they've declared a climate emergency. They have regular wildfires and flood and drought. And, so they're definitely focused on improving resilience and working on climate. And it's a county with a lot of acres of agriculture, but also a pretty robust restaurant industry. Pre-coronavirus, this county's restaurant industry was over $800 million. And so the goal there is to basically get a few chefs and restaurants in that county to opt into the program, do some proof of concept work, conduct some carbon farming projects, funded by 1% coming from those early adopters and leaders restaurants. And then that's sort of paving the way for the progressive policymakers in the region to flip it from an opt-in by a few leaders to an opt-out, where every restaurant in the county would participate, any business could still opt out, and then even at a participating business, any customer could opt out. And so again, going back to that community choice aggregation model in renewable energy, where the default is we're making this change, and you sort of have to opt out to not be part of it, but 99.9 or whatever % of people just don't opt out. And so in Sonoma, or I'm sorry, in this county, that would have generated over $8 million pre-coronavirus each year. And so it's like a really robust way to make progress on climate action plans and make change on, tens, potentially hundreds of thousands of acres without, really fundamentally making anybody change what they're doing that much. Like if you can imagine going to a restaurant and you were going to order a sandwich for $10 and now it's $10.10. It's kind of not that big a deal, and especially if you could opt out. And so that's kind of the theory of change behind Zero Foodprint and Restore California. And then super quick, there's also the potential for this model to scale at a corporate level or a campus level. And in those cases where there's maybe not a retail transaction, a business or institution could participate by kind of the normal or previous Zero Foodprint process, which is by going carbon neutral, which involves a life cycle assessment, and then addressing your scope 1 and 2 emissions through offsets, which makes you officially carbon neutral, and then addressing your ingredient use, which is a scope 3 emission through carbon farming. And for most institutions that are like a high volume food program, the ingredients represent like 70, 80, 90% of the carbon footprint of a food program. And so, really in this case, the vast majority of the effort would be directed towards agricultural climate solutions. And in the case of university, I think the most compelling way that this would play out is as an opt-in, where maybe like, you do the study, you kind of figure out like, okay, it would cost $50 per student to make their whole meal plan carbon neutral. Let's just offer it to everybody as they're signing up for their meal plan next year. Maybe only 10% of people apply or sign up. Maybe the next year it's 15, maybe the next year it's 20. You can kind of see over time that a program like that could or should gain traction on a university, and across like 5,000 higher education institutions in the US. There's a really unlimited scaling potential here. So I should probably stop there and I see there's a lot of questions piling up, and I'm happy to talk in greater detail about any of these things, but I'll stop sharing for now. All right, hi guys, thank you for the very detailed and excellent questions. So there's one that I think is coming up a lot here, so I definitely want to address it, and I think it's been asked in a bunch of different ways. So I'm going to just try to sum them all up in one question, which I is the right one. Why eat cows at all? There's a different question that says, in Project Drawdown, managed grazing is given a carbon saving potential of 16 gigatons. By contrast, plant-rich diets are given a carbon potential of 65 gigatons. Why aren't you advocating for plant-rich diets? And so I think we are certainly advocating for plant-rich diets, and we are also advocating for managed grazing. And I think that the crux of it comes down to the understanding of grassland and the ecosystem itself, which is why the question of why eat cows at all comes up. One example of this is that on the 760 million acres of grassland in the US, there used to be more pounds of bison and livestock than there are today, despite our huge appetite for cheeseburgers and steaks. What has happened is the bison have been eliminated, and that land has been carved up through real estate markets and the commodity food system with a bunch of fences. And so in essence, the idea of managed grazing is kind of like optimizing the farming practice and land management to take carbon out of the atmosphere in a way that is practical for kind of like capitalism, basically. It's like a social capitalist solution that is not in conflict at all with other solutions such as plant-rich diet. I think the emphasis that I'm giving here is that there's an opportunity for a yes and instead of just saying the plant-rich diet. And also that some of the studies cited here are kind of based on, for lack of a better description, dated understandings of soil carbon. And maybe the best way, let me try to find a link and I'll share it in the chat, but the best way to understand it is that there's a new understanding through biogeochemistry of how many tons of carbon 1 acre of soil can sequester or retain. And, anecdotally, it's probably closer to like 60 or 100 tons per acre than the previous understanding. And so as that science starts to play out, it's going to be pretty imperative to change the way that land is managed rather than just, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to get back to everybody here on the chat. Here's one link that is kind of analyzing it from a global level and taking into account the new soil carbon opportunities. But basically, despite the previous understanding about methane emissions and stuff from cattle, the carbon potential from soil far outweighs it by an order of magnitude because of the new biogeochemistry. And so I'm not necessarily like the expert on that, but one example is coming from the ranch Stemple Creek, where we were sourcing at the perennial. And so managed grazing was being conducted on 3,600 acres, and compost application plus managed grazing was part of a pilot program that was on, oh, I see. Thanks, Robbie. That was on 1/10 of the ranch on 350 acres. And that part of the ranch with the compost plus managed grazing was taking in 6.2 tons of carbon per acre per year, more than 10 times per acre per year the rest of the ranch, single compost application at the start of the pilot. And so again, this is like brand new science. That pilot led to a dozen other pilots that are kind of in year 2 right now. But basically like the prevailing wisdom is cows burp, and if they live longer, they burp more. But what that oversimplified understanding doesn't take into account is the actual function of the ecosystem requires the cattle, and in the cattle, the arid landscape would, in many cases, suffer and potentially become desertified. And then even apart from that kind of like general understanding, then the new understanding is, oh, actually the soil can take in like 10 times more than we thought before, so it dwarfs the burps. But I'm happy to debate or send links and stuff to anybody who wants to bridge that discussion. My email is anthony@zerofoodprint.org. And so I'm just scrolling through a couple of the other questions here. Our entire team of Zero Foodprint is 4 people, and we just kind of are starting to get rolling on this agricultural climate solutions work. And so we would love to work with more counties and, basically collaborate with whoever is interested in bringing this model or scaling this model. I think the missing pieces for us are just that it's kind of like a brand new model. And also we're so small that we're kind of just getting started. So if anybody in the chat wants to get in touch and collaborate, we would love to work with you in your region or your industry. Let's see, so I'm reading through some of the other questions. One says, how are the funds distributed to farmers and ranchers practicing regenerative agriculture / carbon farming? And basically, a farmer or a rancher applies in conjunction with the local resource conservation district or the UC cooperative extension or their kind of go-to technical service provider. And then we sort all the applications based on climate return on investment. And then there's a few other bonuses for like if you're in one of the participating restaurant supply chain, or if you're a historically underrepresented group or something. But otherwise, the primary selection criteria is dollars per ton of carbon. Sorry, so somebody asks here, what's different about the actual farming practices to sequester more carbon? And so I just wanted to touch on that because I mentioned at the very, there's a wide spectrum of what could be considered regenerative or what could be considered carbon farming. And basically our definition and there's a list of 36 practices maybe from the Natural Resource Conservation Service that increase the amount of carbon and living organisms in the soil. And those could be simple things like compost application or planting cover crops, planting trees on rangeland. It could be riparian restoration, managing the way cattle graze, reducing tillage, planting contour buffer strips. There's a bunch of different, farming practices. And I think as someone else in the comments and questions points out, this is basically just good farming. And so fundamentally, the challenge is that in the US, the Farm Bill sends, some $200 billion every 5 years towards practices that are not improving soil health. It's almost like funding practices that degrade soil health. And so there are such intense market distortions basically that in order for farmers to overcome the challenges and make changes, they need this sort of grant funding or soil health incentives that are linked to practices. And so part of our grant process is basically that the farmer or rancher is signing a contract saying that, as part of receiving the funds and applying to do this work, they're actually contractually obligated to do the work. And so that's a lot different than just kind of buying from a good farmer and hoping that the system changes someday. Sorry, quite a lot of questions have come in, so I was trying to scroll through. Somebody asks what the asterisks are for on the restaurant list. And so that basically is just indication of which restaurants are carbon neutral, having also completed a life cycle assessment and are purchasing verified carbon offsets in addition to their agricultural climate solutions. And then the first question on the list, the pandemic has exposed how broken parts of the food system are. What opportunities come out of this work you're doing? Well, thanks first of all for phrasing that as an opportunity. I mean, there's no question that the restaurant industry is not in a good place economically right now. Like, there's a lot of operators who are struggling. Industry overall is kind of on life support, I would say. But by the same token, I think, you know, many of us are realizing and understanding that we need to change the food system, and also that the main way for these kinds of like really big changes to happen is through collective action. And so, you know, we're kind of seeing that play out, especially recently, in terms of people kind of working to be anti-racist. And so basically this is in some ways kind of creating an economic system to, you know, actively work against the current extractive capitalism in the food system. It's hard for me to both read questions and try to answer them. And so I'll be glad if anybody else wants to like verbalize questions, but quite a few have come in, so it's hard to read it and try to answer at the same time. And somebody asks about Santa Clara. We are in touch with some folks there in the planning department who are organizing like an agricultural resilience initiative there. But if there are other folks, we would love to work with them. And we are familiar with Kitchen Table Advisors, and they are doing great work as well, primarily around kind of like farmer livelihood and business planning, although they are also focusing on, you know, sustainability to a certain extent. And so we hope for closer collaboration with them in the long run.
Anthony, one of the questions I'm actually curious for, as you know, new to climate change and the processes I'm, you know, learning on a daily basis. Pamela asked if you would do a process review, kind of an overview of this for those who are new to the topic. So this would be you taking a step back from the deep discussion we're having and offering a quick overview for those that might be newer to the subject.
Sure. Could you say this topic? Could you define what you mean by this topic, or what you think Pamela means?
That's a good question. Pamela, if you are still here, and if you want to clarify that, my sense of the general overview of this would be sequestration, carbon sequestration, you know, the whole process with regenerative soils and farming, kind of what's the basis of that and where did it come from? That would be my sense of an overview.
Sure. I touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but I think to me the easiest analogy is between soil and forests. And so I feel like when you plant trees, you are, you know, actively creating the biomass of a tree, and it is coming out of the atmosphere to become the tree. Like, that tree represents carbon coming out of the atmosphere. Likewise, when you cut it down and then it decays and goes back into the atmosphere, that's carbon, you know, cycling back into the atmosphere. And so I think basically the principle of regenerative agriculture and carbon farming and, you know, really good farming and healthy soil is that the soil can either store or release all that carbon in the form of living organisms in the soil, or like biomass from like, you know, decay and different substances, you know, creatures as they're like breaking down and going through different life cycles. I can send a link that's like a pretty good pie chart of what the average is between like, you know, biomass and decay and different things. But long and the short of it is, the more living things in soil, the more biomass in the soil, and the less carbon in the atmosphere. And we have more or less, like in the last 100 years of conventional agriculture, released by some estimates, like over 100 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere through our farming practices. And so a lot of like carbon farming and regenerative ag and the climate potential there is basically restoring it in the soil.
Great, Anthony, thank you. Would you like to take this opportunity to maybe answer one more question?
Sure. I'll do a quick one at the bottom. What do you think about biochar as a method? Love it. There's a lot of research being done now by the Muir Institute at UC Davis around the combination of biochar and compost. And I think that has a lot of potential to lower some of the ammonia and other emissions associated with compost creation. But I mean, the bigger thing with compost is just to think about, like, you know, there's, in San Francisco, I think we collect like 700 tons of compostables per day. And some of the new work around compost is showing that like, that is having, that compost can have an inoculant effect when applied to farmland, you know, so not just kind of like, if you put a ton of compost on, of course, there's an extra ton of organic matter on the, you know, farm, you know, net above the amount of compost you're putting on, and repeatedly, potentially in grassland over the course of many years, an ongoing increase. And so basically like compost can help nature heal itself very quickly. And so it's a shame that in California, we're only collecting probably around 10% of that organic matter, and compost, or, you know, and there's like a huge opportunity, like just in the single field of compost application in farming.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anthony, so much. I'm just so glad that we were able to reschedule this with you. And even though it's in a virtual format, at least it could happen. Thank you again for taking the time today to present to all of us. And thank you again to everyone that attended this event. I have posted the links for Anthony's organization in the chat box, and we can also send that in the follow-up email. We also posted a short post-event survey. We'd really appreciate it if you could fill it out so we can improve our virtual events. Thank you again, everyone. And one final thing to say is that we will be offering a recording of this lecture. So if for any reason you miss any portion of it, you will be able to rewatch it. Great. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.